At 42 years old, Adeline Ferris stood on the porch of a house that no longer belonged to her, holding everything she owned in a single flour sack. It was her late husband's cousin, Harmon Teal, who had ridden out that morning with the county sheriff at his side, to tell her the farm was his now, signed over in a debt she never knew her husband owed him. What she had left after the wagon was loaded was $11.40, a tin of her mother's sewing needles, and the deed to nothing at all. 3 days later, at a dust-choked estate auction on the edge of Larkspur Hollow, she paid $2 for a rusted grain silo that stood crooked on abandoned land nobody else would bid on, its door rusted shut, and its bones groaning in the wind. Her only companion through it all was a red-coated dog named Copper, who pressed against her skirts as the auctioneer laughed and moved on to better lots. It was, by any measure, a foolish purchase. A tower of rust on a dead man's land, bought by a woman with nothing left to lose. But sealed inside that silo was something that would not only change the shape of Adeline's life, but would return to an entire town what it had quietly lost long ago. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Ferris and her faithful dog Copper. If this story finds you in a season of your own, waiting, rebuilding, or wondering if anything you've been given is worth keeping, we'd love to hear where you're listening from in the comments below. Adeline had been raised on the flat, wind-combed prairie outside a town called Larkspur Hollow, Kansas, in a household where nothing was thrown away until it had given every last measure of its use. Her father, Ezra Whitcomb, had been a wheelwright, a man of few words and fewer complaints, who mended broken things with the patient conviction that most objects, like most people, were not ruined, only overlooked. Her mother, Constance, kept a garden that fed 3 families through the lean years of the early 70s, and it was from her that Adeline learned the quiet arithmetic of making a little stretch into enough. She grew up believing that value was not always announced by a fine coat of paint or a proud new barn. Sometimes it was buried under grime, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. That belief would follow her the whole of her life, long after the wheelwright's shop had closed and her parents were laid to rest in the churchyard on the hill. She married Thomas Ferris when she was 23, a soft-spoken man with calloused hands and a gift for coaxing wheat out of soil that other farmers called stubborn. Together they built a modest, honest life on 80 acres east of town, and though children never came to them, they filled the silence with work and with each other, and later, with dogs. There had been a dog before Copper, Old Samuel, a graying collie who had died peacefully in the barn the winter Thomas turned 40, and Adeline had grieved him the way one grieves a member of the family, because on a farm that was exactly what a good dog was. It was Thomas who brought Copper home the following spring. A rust-colored pup with oversized paws, and a white blaze down his chest, purchased for the price of a sack of cornmeal from a neighbor whose bitch had whelped too many. "Every house needs someone loyal in it," Thomas had said, setting the pup in Adeline's lap, and she had laughed and cried at once, because she understood he meant more than the dog. In those early weeks, Adeline worried the pup would never settle to farm life, for he chased his own shadow across the yard and barked at the milk cow as though she were some great invading beast, and Thomas laughed and said the dog would grow into his sense before he grew into his paws. He was right. Copper grew into a steady, watchful animal, the kind of dog who seemed to read a room before he entered it, who slept across the threshold of their bedroom door each night, as though he alone had appointed himself their guardian. He learned the boundaries of the farm before he was a year old, learned the sound of Thomas's wagon from half a mile off, learned to sit patiently at Adeline's feet while she worked her needle by lamplight. It was Copper who first noticed the change in Thomas the autumn he began to cough, long before Adeline let herself believe anything was wrong. The dog would not leave her husband's side, would whine softly at the bedroom door, would rest his head on the quilt over Thomas's chest as if he could listen the sickness out of him. When Thomas died of the fever that took so many that year, it was Copper who stayed pressed against Adeline through the worst of the nights that followed, through the silence that came after the last neighbor's condolence wagon had rolled away, through the long winter, when grief was the only crop the farm produced. She had raised her share of hardship before, but never alone, and it was the dog's steady breathing beside her in the dark that taught her she was not entirely without company in the world. In the 2 years since Thomas's passing, Adeline had done what women in her position were expected to do, and rather more than they were expected to manage. She worked the farm herself, with the help of a hired hand 2 days a week, sold eggs and preserves at the Larkspur Hollow market, mended harness leather for the livery in exchange for feed, and kept her small household solvent through nothing but stubbornness, and the same patient arithmetic her mother had taught her. She was, by the account of anyone who knew her, a capable woman, perhaps too capable for the comfort of certain men in town, who preferred their widows meek and their debts collectible. Chief among these was Silas Vane, who ran the grain exchange and held the mortgage papers on half the farms in the county, a man whose smile was as smooth as his ledgers were crooked, though no one in Larkspur Hollow had yet found the courage or the proof to say so aloud. It was Harmon Teal, however, who delivered the blow that ended Adeline's tenure on the Ferris farm, and he did it with a document Adeline had never seen, and a debt she had never known existed. Thomas, it turned out, had borrowed against the farm 2 years before his death, to cover a bad season, and the note had passed through channels Adeline did not fully understand, and was given no time to question, into Harmon's hands, co-signed, curiously, by Silas Vane himself as witness. When Harmon arrived with the sheriff, and the paper proving the debt was due in full, immediately, with no grace period extended, Adeline asked only one question: why now, after 2 years of silence? Harmon did not answer. Vane, standing at the edge of the yard, with his hat politely in his hands, said only that business was business, and that he was sorry it had come to this, though his eyes carried none of the sorrow his mouth pretended. The eviction took 4 days from notice to departure, and in that time, Adeline sold what she could, gave away what she couldn't carry, and packed the rest into a single wagon that Copper rode beside rather than in, unwilling to be parted from her for even the length of a wagon bed. She did not weep in front of Harmon Teal, and she did not weep in front of the sheriff, and she did not weep in front of the neighbors who came to watch with the particular hunger small towns reserve for another family's ruin. She saved her weeping for the last night, alone in the loft of the barn where she had chosen to sleep, because she could not bear the empty house, with Copper's head heavy and warm against her side, and she allowed herself exactly that one night before deciding, in the gray hour before dawn, that grief was a debt she did not intend to keep paying past its due. She would rebuild. She did not yet know how, or where, or with what, but she knew the shape of the decision, the way she knew the shape of good soil, and she rose before the sun to begin. What she had, when the farm was finally gone, and the last of Thomas's debts settled from the sale of the livestock, was $11.40, a rented room above the seamstress's shop in town, and Copper. It was not by any accounting enough to start a new farm, or a new business, or even a particularly comfortable winter, but it was hers, free and clear, and Adeline had learned long ago from her father that a person who owned a little outright was richer than a person who owned a great deal on borrowed time. She spent her first week in town taking in mending and selling what preserves she had managed to save from the farm's larder, and it was in that week, wandering past the courthouse notice board on an errand for the seamstress, that she saw the auction bill for the old Hollis property out past Miller's Creek, abandoned for 11 years, tax forfeited, to be sold whole or in parcels to the highest bidder, however small. The Hollis land had a reputation in Larkspur Hollow that no honest person quite wanted to say aloud, the way certain places accumulate a hush around them, without anyone remembering exactly why. Ezra Hollis had been one of the town's founding settlers, a quiet, devout man who had platted half the original town lots and given the land for the church and the schoolhouse, and who had died alone on his own property in the spring of 1878, under circumstances the county coroner had recorded simply as natural causes, though old-timers exchanged glances whenever the subject came up. His heirs, distant and disinterested, had let the land go to seed, and then to the tax rolls, and for over a decade nothing on the Hollis property had drawn so much as a curious trespasser, let alone a buyer, save for the boys who dared each other to touch the old grain silo standing crooked at the edge of the dried creek bed, and run before something inside could grab them. The auction, when it came, was a small and dispirited affair, held on a gray Tuesday, with a wind that smelled of rain and rust. Most of the good parcels, the house lot, the orchard, the near pasture, went for modest sums to men who saw good soil and nothing more. When the auctioneer, a portly man named Wexler, with a voice like a rusted gate hinge, arrived at the final and least desirable lot, a quarter-acre of scrub containing nothing but the ruined grain silo itself, its door rusted shut, its cap sheeting peeled back like the lid of a tin left too long in the rain, the crowd actually laughed. "Who wants a tower of rust and creek-bed weeds?" Wexler called, more to fill the silence than in expectation of a bid, and Adeline, standing near the back with Copper's rope looped loosely in her hand, surprised herself and everyone within earshot, by raising 2 fingers, and saying, in a voice steadier than she felt, $2. There was no second bid. Wexler blinked at her, glanced at the silo, glanced back at her, and brought down his little wooden hammer with the resigned air of a man closing out a chore rather than conducting a sale. A few of the onlookers chuckled outright. She heard Harmon Teal's cousin murmur something to a companion about widows with more grief than sense, and she let it pass over her the way she had learned to let most things pass, because $2 was $2 she had chosen to spend, and it was the first choice she had made freely since Thomas's funeral. When she walked out to see her purchase that same afternoon, Copper trotting ahead of her through the tall grass with his nose already working the unfamiliar ground, she told herself she had bought a stack of scrap metal that might, with luck, be sold for salvage to cover a month's rent. She did not yet let herself hope for more than that, because hope, she had learned, was a coin best spent carefully. The silo stood taller than it had looked from the road, a corrugated tin cylinder some 20 feet high, its base wrapped in a decade of creek-bed brambles, its riveted seams streaked orange and black with rust that had run like old blood down its sides. The door, a narrow, man-sized panel meant for a farmhand to slip through to check the grain level, had rusted into its frame so completely that Adeline's first attempts to pry it with a fence stave did nothing but bark her knuckles. She was on the verge of giving up for the day, of admitting that $2 might have bought her nothing more than a very large piece of scrap iron she could not even access, when she noticed Copper had gone still at the base of the silo in a way she had learned, over 3 years of his company, to take seriously. He was not barking, he was not digging. He simply stood with his nose pressed to a gap where the tin met the fieldstone foundation, his tail low and steady, and made a low, urgent sound in his throat that Adeline had heard only twice before, once when he had located a lamb trapped beneath a collapsed fence rail, and once the night he had woken the whole house to a chimney fire before the flames had even shown themselves through the roof. It was, she had come to understand, the sound he made when he had found something that mattered, and needed her to understand it mattered too. She knelt beside him in the dry grass, ignoring the ache in her knees, and pressed her own ear near the gap, and heard nothing but the wind moving through a hollow space. The particular echo of an enclosure that was not, as she had assumed, packed floor to ceiling with rotted grain, but was instead largely empty, as though something inside had been carefully arranged, rather than simply abandoned. It was a small thing, that hollow echo, but it was enough to make her sit back on her heels and look at the tower with new eyes, and to feel, for the first time since the auctioneer's hammer had fallen, the faint and unfamiliar stirring of curiosity. She returned the next morning with a proper crowbar borrowed from the livery in exchange for a promise of mended harness, and this time, Copper did not merely sniff at the door, but planted himself directly in front of it, refusing to move even when she asked him twice to sit aside, until she understood he meant to stand watch over the work rather than the ground. It took the better part of an hour, and every measure of strength she had built up over years of farm labor, before the rusted hinges gave way with a groan that seemed to come from the whole structure at once, and the door swung outward in a shower of orange flakes to reveal a darkness that smelled of dust and dry tin, and faintly, of something like old cedar. Copper did not wait for an invitation. He slipped past her ankles into the gloom before she could call him back, and she heard his claws scrabble against the silo's tin floor, and then heard him stop, and go quiet, and begin that same low, urgent sound she had heard the day before, only now it came from somewhere near the center of the enclosed space, rather than from outside its walls. Adeline followed him in with the lantern she had thought to bring, and the light showed her a silo that had never, in fact, held a single bushel of grain. The interior walls bore no chaff, no scattered husks, no rot of old harvest, only a floor of hard-packed earth, and standing at its center where Copper had planted himself with his nose pressed flat against the boards, a low wooden platform some 4 feet square, built with the same careful joinery she recognized from the old church pews her father had once repaired, and sealed along every edge with a tar-black pitch that had held fast against 11 years of prairie weather. It was, she understood slowly, not a silo at all, not in the sense of a place for storing grain. It was a vault, disguised as the most unremarkable structure a farm could own, precisely because no thief, no tax assessor, and no curious neighbor would ever think to look twice at a rusted grain tower on a dead man's abandoned land. She spent the better part of that first week working at the sealed platform in the evenings after her mending work was done, prying gently at the pitch-sealed edges with tools better suited to patience than force, while Copper kept his post beside her without fail, lying with his chin on his paws but his ears never fully at rest, rising every so often to circle the platform and sniff at its corners as though confirming, again and again, that whatever lay beneath deserved her continued attention. It was on the 5th evening, with the light nearly gone, and her hands raw from the work, that the last stubborn seam of pitch finally cracked, and the platform's lid lifted free on a hinge, so well oiled with beeswax, that it might have been sealed the week before, rather than more than a decade past. Beneath it lay a chamber lined in cedar, dry as the day it was built, and inside that chamber, Adeline found what Ezra Hollis had spent the last years of his quiet life protecting, a heavy iron strongbox, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had clearly meant for someone, someday, to read every word. The strongbox, when she worked its simple latch free, held silver coin, not a king's fortune, but a substantial sum, several $100s in coin, that had not seen daylight since before Rutherford Hayes left the presidency, alongside a folded document, whose wax seal identified it, even by lantern light, as the original 1858 charter of Larkspur Hollow, the founding deed that established the town's common lands, the schoolhouse lot, the church ground, and 40 acres of shared grazing pasture that Ezra Hollis had donated outright to the town's founding families, to be held forever in common, and never sold to any single owner. The ledger told the rest, in Ezra Hollis's own careful hand, and Adeline read it that night by lantern light, with Copper's head heavy across her lap, her own breath going shallow as the old man's story unfolded across page after brittle page. Ezra had written it, evidently, in the last months of his life, as though he had understood he might not live to see the wrong he described corrected, and wanted to leave behind more than suspicion. He wrote of Josiah Vane, Silas Vane's father, dead now these 15 years, a man he had once trusted as a fellow founding elder, who had begun in the years before his death to quietly file forged amendments to the town's land records, altering the common charter parcel by parcel, to redraw the shared grazing land as private holdings under the Vane family name, A slow theft executed one falsified survey at a time, banking on the fact that no one troubled themselves to compare new filings against an old, half-forgotten founding charter that most in town assumed had been lost in the courthouse fire of 1871. Ezra had discovered the forgeries by chance, confronted Josiah privately, and been rebuffed with threats thinly disguised as neighborly advice. Rather than risk the original charter being destroyed or further falsified once Josiah understood it still existed, Ezra had hidden it. Along with the town's original relief fund, silver set aside by the founding families for exactly the kind of hardship that follows drought, fire, or death. Inside the false grain silo he built for that very purpose, trusting that someday, someone patient enough and honest enough would find it and set the record straight. He had died, the ledger's final entry suggested, before he found the courage, or the occasion to do it himself. Whether that death had truly been natural, the ledger did not say, and Adeline found she did not wish to guess. She sat with that knowledge longer than she sat with almost anything else in her life, because she understood immediately what it meant, not simply that she was, in the narrow legal sense, now the owner of several $100s in silver coin and a curious old document, but that the true weight of what she'd found belonged to the whole of Larkspur Hollow, and that the man currently holding half the county's mortgages under threat of foreclosure was the son of the very man who had stolen the town's common ground to build his fortune in the first place. It was Copper, restless and unwilling to settle even after the discovery was made, who first drew her attention to a second, smaller compartment beneath the cedar lining, worrying at a loose board with his paw until she lifted it to find a set of surveyor's original stakes, and a hand-drawn plat map matching, stake for stake, the boundaries described in the 1858 charter, proof enough to satisfy any court that the common land's true edges had never actually moved, only the paper describing them. She did not rush to spend a single coin of the silver, nor did she rush to tell a soul what she had found, for she understood, turning the ledger's pages by lantern light, with Copper's steady breathing beside her, that a secret this old had waited 15 years to be uncovered, and could afford a few more days of careful thought before it was let loose upon the town. She copied Ezra Hollis's account twice over in her own hand, in case the original should ever be lost or stolen, and she walked the disputed pasture boundaries herself, at dawn with the old surveyor's stakes in a burlap sack, matching them where she could against the fence lines Vane's family had quietly moved year by year, until she could see with her own eyes the shape of the theft the ledger described. Copper walked every foot of that boundary with her, pausing at each buried stake as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that the ground itself was part of what needed defending. Word travels fast in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and faster still when a widow with nothing to her name begins asking the county clerk pointed questions about survey records from 3 decades past. Within a week, Silas Vane arrived at Adeline's rented room above the seamstress's shop, his smile as smooth as ever, though something behind his eyes had gone tight and watchful. He offered, with great show of neighborly concern, to purchase the old junk she'd apparently found on the Hollis land, sight unseen, for a sum considerably larger than $2. $50, he said, more money than she'd likely see again in a year, and more than fair for a stack of documents no court would trouble itself over after all this time. Adeline declined, as gently as she could manage, and watched the neighborly mask slip half an inch further. What followed was not violence. Vane was too careful a man for that, and too concerned with his own respectability, but it was pressure, applied in the particular ways available to a man who controlled the grain exchange and half the county's paper. He was patient about it, the way a man is patient, who has never yet failed to get what he wants through some quieter means than force, and for a time, it seemed his patience might be rewarded, for Adeline found herself increasingly alone in a town that had once, if never warmly, at least been civil to her. Adeline found her mending work quietly declined by families she'd served for years, families who depended on Vane's goodwill for their own note extensions, and could not afford to be seen siding with a woman who'd made an enemy of him. The seamstress, kindly but frightened, suggested, with real regret, that Adeline might do better finding lodging elsewhere. Rumors began circulating that the widow Ferris had gone strange out on the Hollis land, that she was making up stories to extort money from a respectable businessman, that perhaps grief had unsettled her more than anyone had realized. Adeline bore it the way she had learned to bear most things, with her spine straight and her voice even, but she confided to no one but Copper, in the quiet of her rented room at night, that she was beginning to understand what it must have cost Ezra Hollis to carry this secret alone for as long as he had, and why he had chosen, in the end, to trust a locked box and a loyal silence, rather than the town's own justice. There were nights she wondered whether she ought simply to take Vane's $50 and be done with it, to let the old wrong stay buried where it had lain for 15 years, and it was only Copper's steady presence beside her, and the memory of Ezra Hollis's careful, hopeful handwriting, that kept her from making a peace with silence that she suspected she would never truly have made peace with at all. It was the town's minister, Reverend Aldous Pruitt, who proved the turning point, though not through any grand intervention. Adeline had gone to him not for his authority, but because he was the one man in town old enough to remember Ezra Hollis clearly, and respected enough that his word still carried weight, even against Vane's money. She showed him the ledger, the charter, and the plat map, and watched his face move through disbelief into something graver and sadder as he read his old friend's careful handwriting, describing a betrayal 15 years buried. Pruitt did not act rashly. He was, like Ezra had been, a patient man. He quietly gathered 3 other long-time residents, men and women old enough to remember the town's founding, and respected enough to be believed, and together, without ever confronting Vane directly, they petitioned the county surveyor's office to conduct an official resurvey of the disputed common lands, citing the newly discovered original charter and stakes as grounds for review. It was a legal process, slow and unglamorous. Exactly the kind of process a man like Silas Vane could not simply intimidate into silence, because it did not depend on any one person's courage, but on the accumulated weight of a document that could not be argued with. The county surveyor, a meticulous and famously incorruptible man named Otis Bramwell, who had no particular loyalty to either Vane or Adeline, spent 3 weeks walking the disputed boundaries with Ezra Hollis's original stakes in hand, and confirmed what the ledger had claimed. Nearly 40 acres currently held under Vane family deeds had in fact never legally left the town's common trust. The forged filings, compared side by side against the original 1858 charter now produced in evidence, showed clumsy alterations that a careful eye could not mistake for anything but what they were. When the county court finally ruled, it did so plainly and without ceremony. The common lands were to be restored to the town of Larkspur Hollow in trust, as Ezra Hollis had always intended, and the mortgages Silas Vane held, that had been secured improperly against land he never legally owned, including, as it happened, the very note Harmon Teal had used to take Adeline's own farm, co-signed as it was by Vane himself, under circumstances the court found suspicious enough to review, were declared void. Adeline had not sought this outcome for herself, and it surprised her more than anyone when the court's ruling meant Thomas's old debt, the one that had cost her the farm, was found to rest on paper Vane had no legitimate right to hold, given his father's fraud tainted the very transaction. Harmon Teal, who had profited from a scheme he likely never fully understood, quietly relinquished his claim rather than face further scrutiny, and the Ferris farm, not through charity, not through pity, but through the plain correction of a wrong, became hers again, free and clear, the way it should have remained all along. Silas Vane's business did not collapse in a single dramatic stroke. It simply began, slowly and irreversibly, to lose the trust it had always depended on more than its ledgers, as families who had quietly feared him for years found, one by one, the courage to take their business elsewhere now that his hold on the county's paper had been broken. He left Larkspur Hollow within the year, and no one troubled themselves to ask where he'd gone. The common land itself was returned to public use that same spring. The 40 acres of grazing pasture opened once more to every family in town regardless of what they could afford to pay, exactly as Ezra Hollis had always intended, and the relief fund silver, after the court's approval, was placed into a modest town trust to help exactly the kind of hardship that had once nearly ended Adeline's own story: widows, families burned out by fire, farms failed by drought. Adeline herself asked for none of it beyond the return of her own farm, though the town, in its own quiet way, made certain she never wanted for mending work again, and made certain, too, that everyone who passed the rebuilt marker at the edge of the common pasture understood it had been a woman with $2 and a loyal dog who had set the whole restoration in motion. It is worth remembering, now that the story has unspooled its full length, that everything which mattered in it began with something everyone else had already decided was worthless. A rusted tower nobody wanted, standing crooked on land nobody would claim, priced at $2 because no one troubled to look twice. Adeline Ferris had learned that lesson long before she ever stood at that auction, learned it from a wheelwright father who mended broken wheels rather than discarding them, and from a mother who coaxed a garden's worth of abundance from soil other families called exhausted. She carried that same patient conviction into the darkest season of her own life, when she herself had been discarded by a cousin's greed and a banker's smooth deceit, told in every practical sense that she was finished, that there was nothing left worth salvaging, and it was fitting, in the end, that the instrument of her restoration was not gold, or luck, or anyone's charity, but a rusted silo everyone else had already written off, and a dog who understood, before she did, that some of the most important things in this world are the ones already sealed away and waiting patiently to be found. Copper lived out his years on the restored Ferris farm exactly as Thomas had once hoped he would, guarding the threshold each night, walking the fence lines each morning, growing gray around the muzzle the way old Samuel had before him, never once far from Adeline's side. She kept Ezra Hollis's ledger on the mantel of her rebuilt farmhouse for the rest of her days, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that patience and honesty, however long delayed, tend eventually to find their way to daylight, much like a hollow sound behind a rusted door, waiting for someone willing enough to listen. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline and Copper, and if their story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that nothing truly valuable is ever entirely lost. Before you go, we'd love to know, what's something in your own life that others dismissed too quickly, but that you always sensed was worth more than it appeared? Until next time, stay close.